So we're going to talk about designs of experiments and surveys to get answers to questions. There'll be an optional problem for you at the end of the talk, just so you can confront some of these issues themselves. This talk was put together with the help of some colleagues, and I'll introduce you to them in the next slide. It's not moving. I have to click. All right. The fellow on the left with the long hair is David Sheets. He's head of the physics department at Canisius College. In Canisius, it's outside of Buffalo. He's a physicist, but he's did some very important work on bite marks. He has a couple of books on statistical properties of shapes. And bite marks, of course, is a shape. He works a lot with anthropologists identifying ancient animals and plants. The next person is Bill Tobin, former FBI chief metallurgist, and was head of the FBI's crime lab investigation of the Morrow City bombing, which is the Oklahoma City bombing, and the plane that blew up off Long Island, TWA 800, and several other high-profile cases. The next person is Maria Cuellar. She was a former physics graduate student, passed her exams, decided she really didn't want to be a physicist, so she's finishing up her PhD at Carnegie Mellon in statistics, and was mentored by a very famous statistician who passed away a couple months ago, Steve Feinberg. And the last person, certainly not least on the list, is Lucas Mensch. He's a Cornell graduate and is an assistant professor at University of Pittsburgh. So those are my colleagues. One thing, forensic science is the interface of science with the law, and often it's misused in court, and here's an example of its misuse.
Did anyone in here take Stat 211 with me in the summer this past year? Yes? At least one. Well, anyway, we talked about the prosecutor's fallacy as one example of probability, which is relevant here.
All right, this graph I pulled off the web. Here's what statisticians often talk, and computer scientists often talk about: garbage in, garbage out. And today we're going to be focused on mostly the garbage in and the garbage out. So if you have a poorly designed experiment or survey and you get bad data, essentially there's no statistical model, mathematical model, computer science model in the world that is going to straighten it out, because the information is not in the garbage. And you're going to get garbage results, and worse, if you believe in the fairy tale that your model can save the garbage data, you're actually going to believe your garbage is a steak dinner at the Hilton. Right. But there's another way that we won't cover today to get garbage results. You could have perfect data and then use wrong or incorrect models or statistical procedures, and that'll also give you garbage. And the latter paradigm is mostly what you see in stat courses. They mostly don't focus on design or surveys, but rather focus on finding a perfect model. Today we'll focus on the design. All right, so there'll be three focal points of the talk: flawed design examples in physical science or biological science, flawed examples including sample size flaws in firearm tool marks, and a more detailed look at comparative bullet-lead analysis. And then at the end, we'll have you do an experiment, if you like, about um, the spontaneous human combustion. All right. Forensics has been known to have problems for some time, certainly since the early 2000s. And because of that, the National Academy of Sciences, under its consulting arm, the National Research Council, did an overview of forensic science. And in their report, they have this excerpt: with the exception of nuclear DNA analysis, no forensic method has been rigorously shown to have the capacity to consistently, with a high degree of certainty, demonstrate a connection between evidence and a specific individual or source. That is, they can't reliably identify a perpetrator, with the exception of nuclear DNA, not mitochondrial DNA, but nuclear DNA. And then this last year, and with an edit just before President Obama left office, the President's Council on Science and Technology, PCAST, put out a report on forensic science as well that was highly critical of pattern evidence. And it would read you an excerpt in reply. This is a reply from the National District Attorneys Association. So prosecutors, in its solicit, and what PCAST said, forensic science pattern evidence doesn't live up to its billing. It's not as good. There aren't studies for any pattern evidence that establish its foundation. And they said, but if there are studies that we miss, send them to us. And this is the DA's response: in a solicitation for any relevant scientific studies that may have been missed in the report, PCAST proposes to send forensic sciences and other interested parties on a fool's errand to provide it with appropriately designed research studies that contain empirical evidence establishing foundational validity and an estimation of accuracy of certain feature comparison method. PCAST's request is essentially designed to lure critics of the report into providing studies that will inform certain premises contained within the report that we and others dispute. One collected, these supplemental studies are sure to be rejected, blah, blah, blah. So the report basically, as you can see, is rejected by prosecutors, not so much by the mainstream science, which embraces it. All right, so the examples we'll talk about today are designs for cancer biomarkers, arson forensic markers, markers for shaken baby syndrome, near zero error rates for matches of guns to crime scene, and a never-ending list of other forensic findings. The search for, so we're going to start off with cancer, and the reason I'm doing this is to show that bad designs are ubiquitous in science, and they have a cost, and I don't want to imply that this only occurs for forensic science, but forensic science happens to be a hotbed of these kinds of studies. So scientists would like, and drug companies would like, pharmaceutical companies would like to find biomarkers for early stage cancer. Nearly all cancers, and I know of no exception, can be cured if found early enough. And nearly all cancers, if they're in the later stages when they're discovered, are fatal. So the trick is, for treatment, to find cancers early so that people have a high chance of surviving. And one type of cancer biomarker for early stage that science is trying to find, biologists, oncologists, are blood and tissue markers, proteins in the blood that might be put out by cancers. So there are thousands of biomarker papers published each year, and you'll see a little graph. And only about 2 cancer biomarkers per year are granted approval by the FDA. This unproductive search for biomarkers costs and wastes billions of dollars per year. So here's the graph. The red lines are papers that mention biomarkers. The top graph, the bottom red graph have the number of papers that have biomarkers in their title. And the green triangles are the number of biomarkers approved in a year, and that axis is on the right vertical axis. So you can see some years the most they get approved is 3 years none got approved, and you can figure it's many hundreds of thousands of dollars in research money for each published biomarker, maybe sometimes $1 million. There are other costs with false biomarkers. It's not just that wasted money on the research. I can't give you the company because I was on loan to the National Cancer Institute, and the pharmaceutical company, I can't give you the name, but there is a pharmaceutical company that tried to track down one of these biomarkers, and they came and they said after $250 million they were giving up the search. So it's not only the wasted money on the search for a biomarker, to publish it, but once it's published, if a drug company tries to verify that it actually is a biomarker, there's a lot of wasted resources. Yes?
So just to make sure we're all on the same page about what a biomarker is, a biomarker would be, for example, a protein that maybe you take a blood sample from somebody and you're able to isolate one specific protein, and based on the quantification of that protein, maybe you're able to be able to make predictions. PSA is one example, prostate-specific antigen, that us guys will know about when we get to middle age. It's a protein, and the quantification that your doctor gets out from it is predictive of prostate cancer. Biomarkers are specific quantities, molecular quantities, that we quantify or characterize as present absent and use that as prediction for do you have a disease, for example.
So I'm going to get into that now with the mouse models, but for the guys it's PSA. By the way, they don't do it anymore. At least my doctor says it's not recommended unless there's a prostate problem. But for women who have had breast cancer, there's not a marker for early breast cancer, but for the return of breast cancer. And it's CA125 is a protein that is a marker for the return of breast cancer. Okay, so here's a commonly used design to try to find markers. The design uses pairs of litter of mice, and they're called mouse models. They're not like a math model, y equals a plus bx or anything else like that. They're genetically altered mice, and they knock out a gene. And essentially, these litter mates, they feed tetracycline or some antibiotic to the mice. The mouse, the litter mate that gets the tetracycline develops whatever form of cancer they genetically engineered it to have. So we could have breast cancer, it could have prostate cancer, it could have pancreatic cancer, it could have lung cancer, and the cancer isn't homogeneous. So it could have one of 10 varieties of lung cancer, one of several varieties of breast cancer. Whatever it's designed to do, if it's fed tetracycline, it'll have it. If it's not fed tetracycline, it won't have it. So this is a matched pair experiment where they're genetically matched, basically brothers and sisters, and if it's a gender-specific cancer, it'll be either brothers or sisters. And these mice, the ones that get sick, get the cancer. If you take them off the antibiotic, it goes away. Now, what they do is they take blood or tissue from the mice, and they look for proteins that are either overexpressed in the cancer mice or underexpressed. So a cancer may repress the expression of certain proteins. And the ones that are considered statistically significant are called biomarkers because they're significantly different between the cancer group and not, and the group that doesn't, and that's what gets published in these papers. Now, it is apparent that neither the cancer groups nor the non-cancerous groups are representative of their target population, even for mice. The cancerous mice don't have colds, they're not taking medicines, they don't have broken bones, they're not bruised, they don't have sore throats, and the cancer-free normal mice are also too normal. They don't have any of that either. None of the cancer mice have other forms of cancer, tuberculosis, flu, bruises, moles, etc. As a result, these confounding conditions prohibit evaluation of the sensitivity of the biomarkers, that is, the biomarker to detect cancer in the presence of this, or the specificity that you don't know. A lot of markers published for cancer are actually inflammation products. Your body produces a response if you have an inflammation. So if I were to come over and step on your toe, you might have the same overexpressed proteins as if you had cancer. So in short, this is a good example of a badly designed study. There's no hope, there's no statistical procedure that you could apply to this type of experiment that would focus on a biomarker that was specific to the type of cancer that was being checked. Now, there might be one, they might find 700 different proteins that are markers, and one of them may be a real marker, but, it's non-specific. If cancer, one of the inflammation products might be specific to the type of cancer, but, this experiment isn't going to tell you that. And so there's no analysis. The information isn't in the experiment that any analysis procedure could pull out. So there's no saving this experiment for the purpose for which it was constructed. So it sounds simple enough. You take cancer mice, you take normal mice. Your cancer mice, you're checking for lung cancer. You look for what's overexpressed or underexpressed. There's your marker, aha. But if you think about it, you don't know that you don't have a marker for any inflammation, cold. All right. Next, we're going to do. Yes. Yes.
Well, do mice get cancer without us giving them purposefully?
I don't know, but they're genetically made to have human forms of cancer. They play with their genes so that they will have the equivalent human form of I don't know if they live long enough to have cancer. And by the way, they do the same thing with pigs and rabbits. Mice are just cheaper and smaller. All right. Now, any other questions? All right. Now we're going to do shaken baby syndrome, or what used to be known as abusive head trauma. So the thinking here is babies get killed by being shaken, and produces brain injury and retardation and other problems. And what people would like, the police would like, is a marker so that when somebody comes in and has certain injuries, they can say, aha, you shook the baby, we're going to arrest you because you didn't treat your child right. All right. So there are papers in the literature that say there are markers, a set of three things, and then you're very certain the baby was shaken. They have to have retinal bleeding, a certain kind of brain swelling, and a long bone fracture. If any baby has that, they've been abused. And the people that did this did it at hospitals in Pittsburgh area where abuse was either diagnosed or the person said, I abused my child. And from this survey, they came up with these markers. So let's just assume there's some statistical procedure to find things in the abused babies that come in that aren't in the unabused babies. One problem with the design is if you were looking for markers for abuse of women, you would not only look at women in abuse shelters for women, a battered woman shelter. You wouldn't think that that's your typical population. Another source is the bias in the studies. It's sort of circular. Doctors think this is abuse, so therefore they label the case as abuse. And they think it's abuse because it has the 3 markers. And so there's a problem with that. So specifically, the authors determined that a child was abused if it has the criteria, the 3 markers, or the parents say, yeah, I shook my kid. Of course, with such a study, people get convicted, and then those convictions get overturned because there are physical diseases, certain vitamin deficiencies, and other genetic disorders which cause a baby to shake. And if the baby shakes, they get the retinal bleeding and the head trauma. And I don't know where the long bone injury comes from, but they have 2 out of the 3 with nothing happening. Just as background, in the Pittsburgh area, there are, say 2 cases a year on average, which doesn't sound like many. But in Dallas, because the medical examiner in the Dallas area says that they've never had a case in 35 years because they don't think there's a marker for it. And if a kid's abused, they can find other ways to prove abuse. They don't have to go through shaken baby syndrome. So, for example, in Dallas, Texas, in the last 35 years, there's been 0 cases. And in Pittsburgh, say there's 70 cases. And either people in Pittsburgh are particularly mean, or these biomarkers aren't picking up what they're supposed to. All right, now we're going to go to markers for arson, of which crazed glass, and there's a picture of crazed glass and windows of a house or whatever structure, were taken to be a marker for arson. So the last several decades have seen drastic changes in the way fire scenes are processed and analyzed for arson. A number of indicators such as large alligating, deep patterns of severe scorching, and crazed glass were thought to be markers for arson. Now they don't think so, but people in the past, if they had opportunity and motive to be at a house and they found alligator patterns or crazed glass, they were going to be charged with arson. And the National Bureau of Standards, which is the leading scientific consulting organization for such things in the country, even said, yes, those were markers. And now nobody thinks they're markers anymore. And here's a case in Texas. Cameron Whittingham was executed. They believe he had an up and down relationship with his wife, and he was convicted, charged with arson. The evidence of arson was crazed glass. He was executed. People now don't think crazed glass is a marker. Crazed glass comes from heating glass and cooling it quickly, like being heated in a fire and sprayed by a fire hose with water. And he was executed, and he's very high on the list, number 1 on most people's list for an innocent person who was executed based on bad forensics. All right. Now we'll go on to firearm tool marks. So there are a lot of ways firearms can be used as evidence or things. So there's gunshot residue, or GSR. So if a person shoots a gun, they may have gunshot residue from the primer on their hands or on their clothing. If the gun is very close to a person, they may pick up the person who shot may have gun residue on them. Another form of evidence is the striations, the scratches, and impressions on cartridges and bullets, bullets being the thing that actually goes into a person, from the gun as it goes down the barrel. And the thinking for 100 years, or about that long, over 100 years, is that guns make a unique mark. You find a bullet in a person, you find the gun, you take a test fire, you look at it under a comparison microscope. If you line them up and the striations, the scratches match, or the cartridge cases, you line them up and the impression marks match, then there's a unique gun. You can identify the unique gun that fired it. And they're typically done in murder cases and the like. All right, so what I'm doing is taking out of a published paper by Bill and myself. So firearm tool mark examiners and comparisons are often used in investigation involving homicides, firearms, spent bullets, and a cartridge that are recovered from crime scenes. Most frequently, one or more firearms are recovered during the investigation of a shooting, and then they do a test fire, compare it to whatever cartridges or bullets are found at the crime scene. And the forensic practice used to associate or eliminate a particular firearm as a murder weapon is based on comparisons of striations and impressions and the like. If it is concluded that the submitted weapon matches the crime scene bullet, then the firearm tool mark examiner typically testifies at trial that the crime scene bullets were fired from the gun to the exclusion of all other possible weapons, although sometimes to a practical certainty. Now, I ask you to remember that PCAST statement and the NRC statements about being able to do this. So what we're going to do is look at some summary of a typical paper used to support the conclusions. The authors, one of them was head of the FBI firearm unit at the time, stated that the marks imparted to a cartridge case from different guns rarely, if ever, display sufficient agreement to lead qualified examiners to conclude the specimens were fired from the same gun. So saying if it doesn't match, they're not going to make a false match. And the second hypothesis is that marks imparted to a cartridge case from the same gun will rarely, if ever, lead a qualified examiner to conclude they were fired from different guns. So if they match, they're not going to say they don't match. And this is the paper it comes from is there. So those hypotheses don't cut it to a statistician, and this is, if you've had 211, this is more like a 211 statement. It's a statement about probabilities. These are testable. If you haven't had 211, I'm not going to go through formulations, but statisticians have ways to formulate hypotheses that can be actually tested. Rarely, if ever, is not a testable hypothesis. This is all vague stuff, but in statistics, we don't test vague stuff. So those are reformulated. Factors that can affect the experiments are the charge in the cartridge case. That's the thing you load into the gun. Marks from firing a bullet in the gun depend on the force. The more basically black powder, gunpowder in a cartridge case, the bigger the explosion, the more deep the marks. The shape of the bullet as it goes through the cartridge and the shape of the inside of the gun. Whether undersized ammunition is used or not. Guns are made to fire a specific size of ammunition, but many guns can fire undersized ammunition. If it's undersized ammunition, it's not going to be squeezed by the bullet's not going to be squeezed by the barrel of the gun as it goes down, and it won't have as clear marks. The firearm brand, perhaps the lot it was made, the caliber, the rifling, how the hole in the barrel was made. The examiner's lab There's two basic ways examiners use to match bullets: consecutively matching striations, CMS. That's mostly used on the West Coast. And what they do is they line up, say, bullets, crime scene, test fire, in a comparison microscope so that they blend together. And if there are now 8 consecutively matching striations, or 2 sets of 4, they say it's a match. It used to be 1 set of 5. Then they found, and they would testify it's the gun to a practical certainty, to the exclusion of all others. And then they found guns that didn't match, physically didn't match, they know didn't match, and that had 5 matching. Then they went to 6, and they testified the same way. And then they found guns that didn't match, that had 6 matching. Anyway, they're up to 8 now. The experimental represents of the ammunition and guns were not representative of all guns. They didn't do blinding. The examiners knew they were being tested, and if you know there's a police car behind you, you probably drive more carefully than if there isn't a police car behind you. There's all sorts of contextual information, etc. Generally, these tests are closed population, so you can think of a lineup. That we put 5 people in front of you and say, you know, are any of these the person that stole your purse or your wallet, which is different than picking out a person from the, you know, we have pictures of everybody in New York City. Go find the person that stole your purse or your wallet, which is what they do when they match from a crime. They don't have a set of 4. It's not a short answer of 4 possible answers. Factors chosen by the experiment, they were either Glocks or other cartridge casings. There were 10 Glocks, 1 Beretta, 1 Sig Sauer, 8 FBI examiners. And why that? Only 8. And the FBI always claims that they're the best in the world, so these 8 examiners are supposed to be now representative of everybody else, although they say that they're always the best examiners in the world. 42 test fires were consecutively manufactured Glocks. I won't get into why consecutively. That's supposed to be a hard test. I won't go into here as to why that's a hard test. The other cartridges, it was hard from the write-up of the experiment to know what was on. They didn't do ammunition type, ammunition charge, cartridge case hardness, primer case. The hardness matters because if it's hard metal, it doesn't pick up scratches easily. If it's soft metal, it does. Breech face is the back of the gun that the cartridge case slams against and puts marks on the cartridge case. So all these, there are just, I'm just going to show you, there's tons of different factors that weren't used. I mean, I think our paper list may be 60, but we probably could have doubled or tripled that list. We just wanted to make a point. Yes?
My wife and I like to watch the show Forensic Files, which is, you know, crime procedural, in particular the use of forensic evidence for detectives and stuff. And they frequently have analysis of bullets and trying to say did they come from this gun or not. And they put these pictures up, which are the microscope, and they rotate them and they say there that it was a perfect match or no, it was not a match. Of course, they present it as if, you know, this, you can't question this. You just look at it, and those are clearly the same thing. So one thing I was going to ask about was, suppose you're on a jury or you're a judge, and you have the prosecution with an expert showing these pictures and saying, see, they match. And the defense has another expert who says, yeah, but you didn't control for these things and that kind of stuff. It's my understanding that it's a tricky
Yeah,
enterprise.
since I'm the defense expert that may be on the witness stand,
Yeah.
what we try to do is first say the scientific community, members of the National Academy and the President's Council of Science and Technology, which is really highbrow scientists, think they can't do this. There's no demonstration that they can do this. And I have a case in Alaska coming up next month. And it's just what you say. You take a look at the pictures. The examiner did everything by the book that the examiners are supposed to do, according to the Association of Firearm Tool-Mark Examiners, and they look like a match. But what we're going to tell the judge is there may be other guns that look like a match. It's not that it's, quote, not a match. It's not that these things aren't practically identical. Is that the examiners don't know how many guns could produce almost identical marks. And there are cases where somebody was convicted and the examiner said it was a match, and then somebody else was arrested for the same murder, maybe it was a group murder, so there were multiple shooters, same bullet, and the examiner says their gun matched. And I was in a case in state of Washington, Port Orchard, Washington, state of Washington, where an ex-wife and a baby of a girlfriend were killed. So here's the setup. This guy's abusive to his, I don't remember if he's married or live in, but they had a kid together. And the wife moves out. She has a restraining order against her husband. She has a girlfriend live with her. And the girlfriend brings her kid. The wife's kid was away. The ex-girlfriend wife was in bed with her a new lover. She goes out for a smoke, comes running to the house. I've been shot. The shooter comes in. Nobody identifies. Shoots the girlfriend's kid. So the police go find a cartridge from the person that's the ex-lover, from his first wife, from a gun. The guns come with a fired cartridge and say it matches. Okay, and there's motive. He's ticked off at his ex-lover, girlfriend, wife. His opportunity, he lives in the neighborhood, and they match the gun. But there's no other evidence. There's motive, opportunity, and they got this match. So it sounds like this is clear cut, and the guy was convicted. I'll tell you that. But here's the other story. The woman whose son was killed, his young child, had an ex-lover, just like the woman who was killed, and she had a restraining order against him. When the police went to notify the father that his son was just killed, he has the same brand of gun on him that was used in the murder, that the police don't check. So now we have two people with the same brand of gun. One gun they check and says match. The other person's gun they never check and is no longer around to check. They don't check. So and there's no evidence. There's no other evidence whatsoever. There's no footprints that can be identified. There's no eyewitness. The only evidence other than motive and opportunity is the cartridge case. The guy was convicted. Yes.
Seems like it's so tricky here because it's a jury of everyday people, and it's got to be really hard for them to really say who do I believe and how do I know whether this is really real or not.
It's impossible. Okay, so the most recent ruling on this is a judge in Missouri ruled, this is after PCAST, after this trial out in Washington, about a month later, Bill Tobin was the expert, and the judge ruled that the the tool-mark examiner, the prosecution's expert, could only testify that the defendant's gun was possibly the murder weapon. Couldn't say that it was the murder weapon to a practical certainty. So that's a big change, saying it's possibly the murder weapon, which of course implies it's possibly not the murder weapon, from it is the murder weapon to a practical certainty. So I think we're more decisions like that away from having tool-mark evidence testimony change And right now, this is, I mean, in January, so we're talking last month, the final version of the PCAST report came out with responses to all the requests for evidence they had. They didn't change the conclusions. So over the next few months, we're going to see how this shakes out. But the answer is the judge has to block it. The jury has no way to handle this. All right, and the other thing, funny, I didn't mention it before, but one of the things the FBI people doing the experiment, running the experiment did, is if a cartridge case didn't have clear marks, they wouldn't give it to the examiners. They put that in the paper. They looked at each cartridge case to make sure the marks were clear. If they weren't clear, they didn't give it to the examiner. And I can just see a murder going to a crime scene and having a cartridge case full, looking at it and say, well, it's not clear marks, so I'll pick this one up, but the one with clear marks I'm going to leave behind. So all the hypotheses really should be conditioned on there being clear marks on the cartridge cases and bullets. All right, let's see where I have time. So there were 72 positive IDs, and all of those actually were correct. So they had 100% made. Of the 290 true exclusions, the examiners made only 118. In the other true exclusions, they said they don't know if it's an exclusion or not. They don't count this as an error. A lot of people think it should be counted as an error. So they're negatives that are not identified as a negative. So they would go into court in cases of these we don't know. The bullet could have been fired by the defendant's gun, but we can't say for certain as to how that would be presented. As criticism of the experiment, there was no standard operating procedure. There were 8 examiners. Each of them could have used a different procedure. Factors in the experiment were too few. And only one batch of guns was used. There are tens of thousands of batches of guns made each year. Why one batch would be indicative of the whole manufacture of firearms? You got me. Not a great experiment. And if you put confidence intervals on these findings based on the sample size, even though you have 8 examiners and each one was 100% correct, that's like a sample size of 8 heads. It doesn't mean you're always going to get heads. The chance, the confidence interval for the chance a new examiner would be correct is between 63 and 100% chance. That is, the error rate could be as big as 63% of examiners. Just because you don't get any failures, you flip a coin 3 times, you can get 3 heads or 3 tails, doesn't mean that you have a 2-tailed or a 2-headed coin. And you can learn about that sort of thing in your methodology classes. So I'm going to skip the rest of that.
On the topic of classes, real quick, for you stat majors, you would have seen or will have seen some basic experimental design in Stat 212. So experimental design is a lot of what we're seeing here. How do you design a study or an experiment to be a reliable source of information? There's another class that you will all take called 406. That's design and analysis of experiments. So you get a lot of opportunity to learn more details about how to design an experiment.
And it's really important. As the first slide, that garbage in, garbage out. There's also all sorts of contextual biases here. The police, in actual practice, not in the Houston lab. I'm an advisor to the Houston lab, and they do blinding there. They're the only lab in the country that the examining police officer is not allowed to talk to the person matching the evidence. They have a case control officer that the police talk to, and none of the information. But it's typical for an examiner to get a letter like, we arrested Billy Smith We know he's guilty as hell. All we need for you to do is show that the bullets found at the crime scene match his gun, and we can get this piece of dung off the streets forever. All right. So even though they say that had no, the examiners may say that had no effect on their analyses, you could think of close calls. So if it's not a close call, if it's clear, it's not going to affect things. If it's if it's the wrong caliber of bullet, they're not going to say it's the right caliber of bullet. If it's a very clear match, it's not going to have any effect. But you could think of borderline cases, and there are borderline cases where maybe this is a match, maybe this is not a match, and we got to get this guy off the street. It's a match. So that sort of stuff happens. So there's a whole area of contextual bias that comes in that's, for another day. And here's the sort of picture. So now, matching right now is done in visual light you see. These are two bullets fired from in fact, they're the same bullet. One image here is done in visual light, about 30x magnification. And you can see these scratches are the striations. Here's some down here. The black and white picture was done, it's heat, using infrared. They're infrared procedures. And what I want you to think about is, say the rule for matching is, say, 8 consecutive striations. There are more striations on the right picture using heat than you can see on the left picture. The light is subject to shadows and glare that the heat map isn't. So, for example, you can't really see what's going on here with visual light. You can here with the heat map. This is done with heat. So what does it mean that you have 8 consecutively matching striations when the striations are chosen by visual light? There are not 8 consecutive striations on the cartridge cases, the back of a cartridge case, the hole, the firing pin hole, etc. So you might think about that. Yeah, you got to match 8 consecutive striations, but they're the only striations that you can see with visual light. They're not the actual 8 consecutive striations on the cartridge case. So that's something to think about. All right. So right now I'm writing a book with David Sheets and Bill Tobin on design of experiments used in forensics, and it's an extension of a classic book by Campbell and Stanley used in the social sciences. What we're doing is starting from the simplest examples of forensic science and going to more complicated cases, talking about what's internal validity, correct description of the findings in the experiment, and then external validity, trying to extrapolate to the population not in the experiment. So here's CBLA, examiners, comparative bullet lead analysis. Examiners mastered the difficult task of measuring 7 compositional elements other than lead in a bullet. Bullets are mostly made from recycled lead in car batteries. So about 75% of bullets are made of the lead in bullets is made from recycled car batteries. There are elements, silver, cadmium, what have you, from the car battery. Bullet manufacturers also add antimony. High antimony bullets are light armor piercing, say a 7% antimony bullet. The tip that fires at people is light armor piercing. 0.5% antimony bullet basically splats. When it hits somebody, it makes a big hole, and they will typically bleed to death slowly because you can't patch the big hole. So by Geneva Convention, if you have soft bullets, they have to be jacketed, typically copper jacket, so that doesn't happen because they want, once somebody's down and not a combatant, they don't want them to die slowly. They're out of the fight, they should be allowed to live and be repaired, that sort of thing. All right, so CBLA, it found out, the FBI testified that the chemical composition of bullets in a person's possession, there's no gun, and the chemical composition of bullets found at a crime scene match, then the murder scene bullets must have come from the defendant's box. That was the typical testimony. It was used for 4 decades. First use was in the analysis of the Kennedy assassination, President Kennedy assassination. The benefits for CBLA were to the crime scene unit itself. It created a unit. They had employment. They were allowed to be called forensic scientists. The evidence was allowed in court. It created a culture that was isolated from the mainstream science community. And there's a big issue of who was the relevant scientific community in court. The examiners would say, we're the only relevant community. We do this stuff. We know what goes on. These pinhead university people don't know what's going on. They don't do it. They don't do the chemistry we do. They don't know how to measure the bullets. They don't know what the meaning is. So they would tell the judge, we're the relevant community, and forever, for 40 years, this stuff was admitted. Then the National Research Council came out with a report, and I was one of the authors of the report, that says there were huge flaws in comparative bullet lead analysis. It was misused in the JFK assassination, 60 Minutes, and that was a later paper. 60 Minutes, you all know that show, I assume, in the Washington Post did an expose, joint expose. So Steve Croft and John Solomon at the Post did a expose on it that embarrassed the snot out of the FBI, and they said, yes, this wasn't any good, and they stopped the proceeding. So for the mainstream scientists, it made it more, the isolation made it more difficult to advance science because the insular community up till the end said, we're very good, you guys don't know what you're talking about, until the director of the FBI lab says, no, we don't know what we're talking about, it's over. And it diverted resources away from other fundamental scientific areas in order, I spent time on a panel looking at it, went around and basically changed my career. I could be doing other things other than trying to stop CBLA from being used. In order to develop some notation, just to give you a flavor, the M stands for measurement, PT for positive theory, and then it was used as sort of a design. There was no attempt to verify the positive theory that bullets that matched came from the same box, that bullets that didn't match would have come from different boxes, that there was some uniform mix of bullets across the country, none of which is true, but the FBI never checked, so they didn't even do basic surveys to validify. So this is a case where they had a hypothesis with no experiment to check, just assumed based on intuition that their hypotheses were correct, and when they were checked, they were all wrong. Since CBLA had no internal validity, it was not valid in any way. It didn't have any external validity. And this is a comment for those of you concerned about courts and judges. The very high-tech and advanced aspect of analytical chemistry and measuring lead in bullets dazzled judges and juries. It was, they have to use some of the best reactors in the world. It's some of the most, these are nuclear science. How could nuclear, we all know nuclear science is right. It does wonders. We can make bombs. We can power submarines. How could this possibly be wrong? The problem was it wasn't the nuclear science that was wrong. It was the implications that the measurements were enough, and it wasn't enough. They had to assume that batches of bullets were unique in composition, and they weren't. They had to assume that different batches were different, and they weren't. And they had to assume that the bullets got mixed. In small towns, basically, there's a town in Texas called Cut and Shoot from a very colorful history. It got named long ago. And there's one gun, bait, and ammo store. And I'll bet in rural Texas, lots of people own guns, and I'll bet that everybody that owns a gun in the town has a bullet that chemically matches, because they buy their bullets at the local gun, bait, and ammo store. And here's the way the testimony worked. Somebody's dead and Cut and Shoot. The police officer thinks they have a suspect. They get a warrant. They go to the suspect's house, measure their bullets. You send the bullets to the FBI. FBI measure. They're a match. Therefore, they go to test. Look, this person had a motive. They had opportunity, and they had bullets that matched. The murder bullets came from his box or her box, and that's it. That would be true about the bullets, no matter whose house they went to. Everybody who had a gun had a bullet that matched, but they were saying it's unique to that box, and that's. There was somebody executed from that evidence in town, in Bryan. Aside from what I'm telling you, that guy was actually guilty, but I know lots of stuff about the case, but still very flawed evidence was used to convict him. So here are some references. The last one on the list is, on this page, is the one I got the number of biomarkers from. Part of the addendum of PCAST is there's only one. PCAST found one study that they think might be established fundamental validity. They say it always takes two studies, and this study has not yet been published. I have lots of flaws with the study, but they say the error rate's 1 in 46. If they use some of the more flawed error rate studies for unpublished data again, they get an error rate of 1 in 20. That doesn't sound like a practical certainty to me. If they're making 1 in 20, 1 in 20 cases, they made a mistake. There's some references for that. Let's see what I want to do here. I'm getting to an assignment for you. That's what I'm trying to get to. All right. Here's your voluntary assignment. There's something in the literature, you can Google it, spontaneous human combustion. It's a very funny thing. So it's not so funny, but there have been cases documented where somebody just burned up. They're sitting in a chair, the chair doesn't burn, they catch on fire, and all that's left is the legs. You've got a picture there on the right. There are various theories. Some people think that this is a phenomenon. People just suddenly burst into flames. Used to be think that they were alcoholics, and so forth. And then the scientists are very doubtful. They say they may be alcoholics, but they smoked and they fell asleep, and the cigarette butt caught their clothes on fire, and because they had a lot of alcohol in them, basically their clothes acted like a wick, and they burned up, but the bed didn't. And this is from 2010. You've got some professor that thinks, well, maybe it's not the alcohol, it's that people that drink a lot of alcohol have some acetone in their skin, and acetone is subject to sudden combustion. So that's an issue there. So this voluntary assignment is think about how you would design an experiment to either prove or disprove. So you have to formulate hypothesis. There is such a thing called sudden human combustion. People, you're just sitting there at your chair and your neighbor goes up in flames. And so what factors would you use? What measure of outcome would you use? You're going to do an experiment. Do you wait till they're totally consumed by fire? Do you use the first flame? Do you use their the temperature of their skin goes up. How many replicates do you need to show or not show this? So that's, because it's real easy to sit here like with the mice for the biomarkers or the shaken baby syndrome markers. I wouldn't do that. It's another thing entirely to say, well, how would you do it? You know, how would you design this experiment? And as you take more statistics courses, you'll learn about things like how many replicates you need, how many experimental units, what is your outcome measure, and what things do you vary? You can control some things. You want to feed, say, mice some alcohol? Do you want to see what happens if a drunk mouse gets near a flame? Do you want the drunk mouse to sit next to a heater? I mean, how are you going to do your experiment? And so I'm not expecting you to be able to do this now, but just to have some appreciation of what the people that did the experiments badly went through. You know, suppose it was your job to figure this out. How would you go about doing it? And that's it.
Thank you.
And I'll entertain any questions you might have. Yes?
I have two questions. One, is it ethical to get mice drunk and then catch them on fire somehow just to see if this happens?
It's certainly not ethical if you don't have, you have to get typically internal review board approval. And for an internal review board approval, you have to show efficacy of the experiments and that you have the right sample size. You're not killing too many mice, and you have enough mice to show whatever the conclusion is that you want to show. And that's a very important outcome. That's why the outcome matter. Suppose you don't catch them on fire. Suppose you just get them drunk and measure their body temperature. And if it approaches a flash point, you stop it. So that's part of it. Now, what's your second question?
Well, I took a forensic science course in high school, like an introductory level one.
Yes.
And fingerprint evidence, it first came based on who you're talking to, either Galton or the Scottish physician. But they didn't say fingerprints are 100% accurate. They say maybe this is a way to say that to distinguish between people, and then no one ever tested it. And so when they did start testing it in the early 2000s, they found that, like you said, if you tell them the sort of people that you're testing the fingerprints for, and it's a close case, then they'll rule in favor if they're like a murderer instead of, I don't know, like a...
Yeah, it's contextual bias. So, fingerprints. So here's the hierarchy of what forensic scientists would put their hierarchy on the best. Nuclear DNA from one contributor, maybe two contributors best. They can't do gang rapes. They still can't do gang rapes. Then they would put fingerprints next, firearm tool marks, which I talked about next, and then it's, maybe drug testing or something. Fingerprints also have the issue, and there's a very famous case of Brandon Mayfield, which was a Muslim lawyer who defended a terrorist in trial. The FBI thought his fingerprints were found on a bag left with bomb components in Madrid, Spain. They arrested him, and the Spanish police never believed it was a match. The U.S. FBI believed it was a match. The guy that confirmed the fingerprints, because they have somebody confirm, thought it was a match, and the defense expert the defense hired thought it was a match. The Spanish police never thought it was a match, and they found a North African that everybody agrees was a better match. And after paying Brandon Mayfield a few $1 million, their fingerprint examiners are confronted by that case every time they go to trial, and there are others. Yes?
I have a question. Do you recommend the use of forensic entomology?
Yeah, my daughter's taking it now. It's fun.
Okay. Do you recommend? Do you think it's a valid?
Well, they're trying to establish themselves, and What a lot of the research is now is actually poking holes. So some people think that you can tell the approximate time of death by the what sort of insects are on the cadaver. And the group here has shown that that's not possible because you can at best tell the time of colonization. The bugs grow in succession from when the first bugs arrive. If the first bugs arrive, like the body's frozen and the bugs don't sit on it, then you can't tell. So, but there's some truth, and the group here, I'm friendly with them. I write papers with them. Alan's working with them. They're pretty good scientists. So I think it's, and my daughter Abby is having a lot of fun in the course.
Good.
Okay.
I have one more question actually.
Yes.
So if you're, when you're trying to convict someone, ideally you could show with like a certain degree of certainty that they did commit the crime.
Yes.
But you can never be 100% sure, obviously. Like there's always that, slight percent. What, in like the, in the forensic community, what do they see as like being certain enough to convict someone?
Yeah, that's not their, they should not be concerned with that. The scientist's job in this, now in Europe, they do what you say. They want the, okay. In the US, they do not. They're only supposed to testify about the fingerprint match. After that, or the tool mark match, or whatever DNA match, and they're not supposed to be concerned with anything else. It's not their job to root.
The scientist's job.
Pardon me?
It's not the scientist's
It's not the
job.
scientist's job. It's the court's job, and that's something I want to leave for the court.
Okay.
Yes.
For this assignment, I'm assuming that we need a control group at the test. How would you recommend me to do the control group?
That is your job.
Can I just like have 4 chimpanzee and just burn the first? I'll just like write and some outline burn.
Yeah. So that's what you need to think about. But I would start with mice or maybe insects. But that's, I mean, you can read it. I mean, it's you can Google spontaneous human combustion, and if instead of going to a horror movie, go read about that.
I don't know how to define spontaneous.
Well, you define the outcome measure. That's the second bullet. What outcome measure? I mean, I give you a story. These things happen. It's not a dispute that people caught on fire. That's not disputed. So one description is an old man was sitting with his daughter, and he was, I don't know, doing something, and he turned around, and her head was on fire, and he said flames were coming out of her mouth like she was a fire-breathing dragon, and they put the fire out, but she died a week later. So he thinks it's spontaneous combustion. The scientific community says he was a pipe smoker, and they think his daughter was drinking, and an ash from his pipe lit her up. But you have to define. You have to figure out how to do the experiment. That's yours, because that's these tool mark examiners that made these funny experiments, or the shaken baby syndrome people. They said, I want a marker for shaken baby syndrome. There wasn't like a protocol for them. They made the protocol. And what I want you to do, one of the goals is to see how hard it is to really design the experiment. It's very hard. And that's what you're supposed to get out of this. Yes?
Did your work on fuzzy regression send you towards forensic science?
No, I did a little bit when I was at the Bureau, like Chinese urns, to see if they were fake or not, ancient Chinese urns. But I edited a chemistry journal, and the chemistry component division of the National Research Commission was putting together a panel. So I was editor of chemometrics, and there was another colleague, Karen Cafadar, who was editor of technometrics, and they drafted us to do it. And when I saw how bad that was, I couldn't let it go. I felt like the FBI was less than truthful with us, and that's being very kind. And so I was going around giving talks, and I just got involved more and more. And so it sort of changed the direction of my career. Yes.
I was reading about Deepwater Horizon and the Challenger accident,
Yes.
and it was kind of talking about how everybody was doing within their own little unit the right thing, but too many things went wrong, obviously. And at no time did anyone tell them no. And kind of with what you do seems like is you're going through and saying no to the kind of the old way of doing forensics. Is there a discipline on how you're kind of countering the science to prove that you're using science to prove that science is wrong at times?
Yes.
And then do you get a lot of backlash from that at all?
Yeah, I mean, you saw the letter from the National Association of District Attorneys. So, yeah, I mean, I am not well liked by certain areas of law enforcement. Although I'm a formal advisor to the Houston Crime Lab, and I'm working very closely with the Bexar County, San Antonio Crime Lab. But I would say I'm public enemy number one, except I know that's Phil Tobin's role. I'm public enemy number two, and have had some consequences for it. I mean, it was a huge embarrassment for the FBI to have to stop the CBLA, and they have not forgotten the people that have done that to them. Did you have a question? No. Yes.
So you personally believe that the court should handle like the actual weighing of the evidence?
Yeah. So there's a Daubert standard in federal trials. Some states adopt that, and for others there's a Fry standard. But basically, in order for science to be introduced in court, it has to be repeatable, reproducible, reliable, be accepted by the general scientific community, and that's where it gets in. What is the relevant, by the relevant scientific community? The examiners say we're the only relevant scientific community. None of these other people should be listened to. The mainstream science community says, look, we're scientists, we evaluate cancer, we evaluate rocket failures, we evaluate every form of science, astronomy. We can evaluate this, and it isn't any good. And the examiners say they don't know, and the judge has to, now this is personal bias, but most people become lawyers because they didn't really want to become scientists. They're smart people, they don't like science, they don't like math. What are you going to do? I'll be a lawyer. So most judges are not fans. They may like science, they may appreciate science, but they don't have a lot of it. There are exceptions, but most of them don't have a lot of it. And now they're in a position where they have to decide who do they believe. So some judges will take the PCAST report, like the one in Missouri, and say, look, the President's Counsel said this is any good, the National Academy says this is any good, you can't testify to a practical certainty. Other judges, they've been doing this for 100 years, it's been accepted in courts for 100 years, I'm not going to be the idiot that says it can't be used. I believe them. You mainstream scientists are a bunch of pinheads. You don't know what you're doing. And that's the way it goes. Each judge for each trial sets it. However, it's looking now like the firearm tool marks may go. We'll see. We'll know by the end of the year because there are enough cases coming up. And if even several of the cases, once you get some judges that won't admit the evidence or will admit it only by saying it's possibly the gun, the other judges aren't going to go against it because mainly it takes a lot of courage to overrule 100 years. And I like that book. Yes.
If they were to do the firearm tool mark test in a more satisfactory manner, their results aren't false per se, but their interpretations are what's wrong with what you're saying?
They don't have this background support. So they're saying there's a match. It isn't the fact that they're saying a match. They may possibly say it should be a match. It's the interpretation. What does that match mean? Are there 10,000 other guns that would also match as good? So what they're saying is they've seen maybe 1,000 guns in their life, maybe 5,000, whatever the number is, a few thousand. And they're saying to the exclusion of all the other hundreds of millions of guns there are in the world don't matter. Well, how do you, from 1,000 experience, do you make that extrapolation? And actually the paper I showed you by Bill Tobin and myself lays out the experiments, but people in the statistics community who are involved in forensics thinks it's no less than 10 years worth of experimentation that would have to be done to establish the field.
So as statisticians, math is an important part of what you do. You'll do some calculations. A very important role that you can play is an objective, skeptical, questioning role. Thinking about how are we going to get the data and what are the limitations of it, what can we actually pull out of it. Next week we'll hear from Jeff Morris and Andy Anderson, and I know he's going to say some of the same things.
Thank you.